Hello and welcome to Global News Today, bringing you exclusive interviews with leading experts every weekday here on Arabiya English. I'm Tom Burges Watson. Coming up on the programme, we'll get all the latest on the progress on the diplomatic effort to broker a deal and end the war in Ukraine. We'll be asking, what will Russia have to say about the modified version of the original 28-point plan? Plus, we take an in-depth look at the Pope's first foreign trip of his papacy. We ask, why did he choose Turkey and Lebanon for this first trip? And what message will he bring with him? Hello and welcome to the programme. We continue our special coverage of the war in Ukraine. Now, a US peace proposal may finally bring an end to the nearly 4-year-long conflict. Let's get a check of the latest. The US President Donald Trump is sending Special Envoy Steve Witkoff to Moscow next week. Well, Ukraine was initially concerned that President Trump's peace proposal favoured Russia and would require Kyiv to make too many concessions. But Ukraine's allies now say they welcome the newly modified plan, which President Trump says meets Ukraine's demands. Meanwhile, Ukraine's European allies are moving quickly to join the talks and offer support. The French President Emmanuel Macron says that French, British and Turkish troops could be deployed to Ukraine immediately after a peace deal is reached. This force, which would serve as a reassurance force, positioned in areas such as Kyiv or Odesa on the day peace is signed, would provide security and training. Now, turning our attention to another news story, Pope Leo arrived in Turkey earlier on today, marking his first trip outside Italy since beginning his papacy. Well, the Chicago-born pontiff, elected in May, is on a 6-day mission of peace and unity in the region. After Turkey, he's going to travel to Lebanon just days after Israeli airstrikes hit the capital, Beirut. Well, I'm joined now by Sir Liam Fox, who is the former UK International Trade Secretary, who also served as the British Defence Secretary. Sir Liam, thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us here on Al Arabiya English. Back in April of this year, you penned a piece in The Telegraph in which you said that President Putin is a liar and a murderer. It is impossible to accommodate him. So what's your view of President Trump's efforts to broker a peace deal with him?
Well, my comments were in general terms with Putin. Putin will not be satisfied with what he's got at any one time. He's the worst combination between KGB ideology and Russian imperial expansionism. When it comes to Ukraine, we have to accept that there was a failure of Western deterrence that emboldened, if not encouraged, Putin to seek, first of all, Crimea and then part of Ukraine itself. We have to draw a line now. We have to say that this far and no more. I think probably with realpolitik, you have to accept that Russia is not going to budge from some of the territory it has. So you need to look ahead and see what gives Ukraine the greatest guarantee of sovereignty and safety going forward.
I mean, if you had any say in the matter, would any of Russia's so-called red lines, i.e. dictating the size of Ukraine's future army, saying that elections must be held within 100 days, saying that NATO membership must never happen, I mean, would you accept any of them?
Well, there have to be compromises, obviously, in reality. Would I accept any of them in principle in a perfect world? No, not for a second. But there are things that realistically you have to look at. Russia's not going to give up the control of the areas that it has, but why should it be rewarded with any territory that it doesn't hold militarily? When it comes to NATO, you can't give a binding commitment to all future governments who make up NATO about what NATO policy will be. These are sovereign, independent countries that will come to their own views. And the other thing you have to take into account is what value you place on Putin's word. It was Russia were signed up to the Budapest Memorandum that rewarded Ukraine for giving up its nuclear weapons with guarantees of non-aggression, including from Russia. So you have to make sure, as Ronald Reagan would have said, trust but verify. If you come to an agreement, how will we ensure that it can be enforced with Putin, who has shown in the past that his views can't be trusted?
Yeah, it sounds like you're of the view that perhaps if this deal does work, it might not bring about a lasting peace, and that President Putin might go along with it, regroup militarily and re-invade perhaps when there's a different occupant of the White House. I mean, do you think that's a likely scenario?
Well, that's why we have to give Ukraine meaningful guarantees of security. The Budapest Memorandum didn't have the force of an international treaty. In fact, at the time, rather to their discredit, the Western allies didn't want a treaty that would have, for example, the force of Article 5 of NATO. And so they gave an agreement to Ukraine that Ukraine should stick by their word. Clearly, the Ukrainians are not going to make that mistake twice, and they're now going to look to get much stronger security guarantees in the future because, as you correctly say, I wouldn't trust Vladimir Putin in any way, shape or form. So we need to ensure that if Ukraine is going to have a ceasefire, if Ukraine is going to just put aside the fact that men, women and children have been killed in the most cowardly attacks by Russia. If Ukraine is going to do that, they need to know that this will not happen to them again.
Just listening to what the Russian Deputy Foreign Minister, Sergei Ryabakov, said in Moscow yesterday. He said, there can be no question of any concessions or any surrender to any of our approaches on these key points. I mean, given that level of intransigence on the Russian part, and given that Ukraine and its allies, the coalition of the willing, have their red lines as well, I mean, do you think this deal stands a chance?
Well, the Russians would say this, wouldn't they, at this point in a negotiation? But all the way through, Russia has been utterly uncompromising. They're not looking for agreement, they're looking for capitulation. And that cannot happen because it sets a precedent that would leave any of Russia's neighbours totally vulnerable to future military attack. So we can see when the rhetoric is left aside what is actually being agreed behind the scenes. And I think the other thing that we need to remember in all of this is that peace is not simply the absence of conflict. Peace is also the absence of the fear of conflict. It's the absence of the fear of being bullied and coerced by a larger power, i.e. Russia. And we need to remember also that we've got a lot of cards in our hand, not least economic cards. And irrespective of what happens in Ukraine, we need to ensure that we're not funding Russia's war machine in the future, and that we can't allow the whole of the free world to be held to ransom by a country with a smaller economy than Italy.
Sure, I mean, the collective West does hold some economic cards, as you say, but why is it that after 3.5 years or so of sanctions, they don't seem to have had the desired effect of, forcing Russia to the negotiating table and forcing Russia to perhaps rethink some of these red lines that we've been talking about? Because it sounds as though Russia would be quite happy to just carry on fighting. That means the sanctions aren't working, doesn't it?
When you say Russia, you mean Vladimir Putin. Putin doesn't have to worry about an electorate. He doesn't have to worry about a free press. And what they think of him, he can press on regardless. And the way that they've simply been willing to throw young men into the mincer of the war shows exactly the views that they have. But the sanctions are having an effect on the Russian economy. They've got an inflation rate of, 11% and a base rate of over 20. That's unsustainable. They clearly have capital problems inside the country. They've got labour problems inside the country. They've got problems with technological supplies coming into the country. There are a lot of levers we still have, and we should be ensuring that the Putin war machine in the future is degraded, that he can't fund this sort of bloody expedition again. And we need to be encouraging our allies to get, first of all, a flow of capital out of Russia, which would exacerbate their banking crisis. And secondly, to ensure that we use the funds that are frozen to help the Ukrainians rebuild their country. The chance of Vladimir Putin ever producing any reparations is, in my view, nil. Therefore, we have to use the money that we have from frozen Russian assets to help rebuild the lives and the infrastructure of the people of Ukraine, who we've seen targeted mercilessly in a fairly appalling and cowardly way. If Russia has a dispute about the borders of Ukraine, to what end? Do you justify killing old people in the flats where they live or children in their playgrounds? It is a completely morally bankrupt campaign by the Russians, and we need to just have a little bit of moral courage when we're talking about it.
So it sounds as though you're in favour of perhaps tightening the screws a little bit more on Russia and saying that this can be done. Were that to be done, wouldn't it be better to then start the negotiation process perhaps a little bit later on when Russia really is feeling quite serious economic pain?
Well, I think that Russia coming to the table at all is indicative of the fact that they are feeling the effects of some of this. Of course, we'll expect them to have a sense of bravado when it comes to the negotiations. Putin likes to see himself as this great strongman. But we simply have to make very clear that if there is to be an agreement, if there is to be a compromise, it is not a surrender. It's not a capitulation. Because we know from bullies throughout history, if you appease them, they'll just do it again.
What did you make of the reports that President Trump's envoy, Steve Witkoff, had given a bit of coaching to one of President Putin's aides to help him to sell the deal back to President Trump again? Did that sound to you? I mean, the White House said that was standard negotiating procedure. What did it sound like to you?
Well, it's impossible to know what was said and how it's contextualized. And I think that there's a bit too much attention given to that. I think we still need to get down to the big picture, which is, what does President Zelenskyy think? What do the Ukrainian people think? And what do the Western allies who are still confronted with Putin's aggression in Estonia and Latvia and Lithuania, in the High North, in the Baltic, in the Caucasus, in the Balkans? These people are all looking to see what lead the free world can give in guaranteeing their future security. There's a lot more at stake than just Ukraine here.
In your opinion, is no deal better than a bad deal?
No deal will simply lead to a continuation of the conflict with greater costs in human life and misery, as well as the financial costs of this. But would a capitulation to everything that Vladimir Putin wants be successful? Would it be acceptable? Absolutely not, because it simply would reinforce his view that we are militarily and morally weak, and he can press his aggressive intent against other countries. So we've got the lessons of history to look at here and recognize that we have to have a credible end to this, which gives Ukraine security and which gives those other countries that I mentioned a very clear indication that we would regard their security as paramount.
And just to wrap up this conversation, Salim, I mean, what's your hunch, looking at all the facts, everything we know, all the reports that we're hearing, how far off are we from a meeting between Presidents Putin and Zelenskyy, some sort of a handshake and a signing of a peace deal? Is that something that's likely to happen anytime soon, in your opinion?
It will take quite a lot of movement, I would have thought, on the Russian side. They've never been willing to give anything at all. They've always, when they say they're red lines, what they mean is they want absolutely everything and give nothing back in return. It's difficult to see how that dynamic plays out. Everything is possible with the right goodwill, but it always comes back down to this point: how much do you trust the person on the other side? We all want to see an end to the fighting in the region, in that part of Ukraine. But, you know, that could all go away tomorrow if Vladimir Putin stopped what has been an act of invasion and aggression against the Ukrainian people.
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. Sir Liam Fox, thank you again.
Thank you.
Well, we can speak now to our guest, Jim Townsend, who's a former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for European and NATO policy at the Pentagon. He joins us from Washington, D.C. Jim, thank you very much indeed. Always a pleasure having you on the programme. Let me just start by asking you, in your view, how much progress has been made in the negotiations in this quest for a deal on Ukraine?
Well, I guess the answer to that is it's all relative. I mean, we've made more progress than we had a month ago or a week ago. At least we have a piece of paper that we're able to focus on in terms of Ukraine and the U.S. We're really trying to deal with some of the thorny issues and where the Ukrainians are and where the U.S. is. So at least there's a piece of paper, there's a discussion, and then there's going to be something to provide to the Russians, although I'm sure they've already seen drafts. So there is some progress here, narrowing down the problems and narrowing down what we need to negotiate. But at the end of the day, the Russians are going to get a vote, and we're going to have to see if they're ready to talk.
Right. And, this time a week ago, we first heard about that plan, the 28-point plan. At the time, it was described as being a sort of a Russian wish list. And now President Trump says it's been fine-tuned, and perhaps it's not even 28 points anymore. Maybe some of the points have been removed. I mean, fine-tuned, getting it from being a Russian wish list to getting it to something that's going to be acceptable to the Ukrainians and the Europeans. Fine-tuned sounds like a bit of an understatement, doesn't it?
Well, it really is. Maybe that's a real estate term, or your car mechanic talks about tuning your car. But I think in the negotiating world, we're talking about a new draft. Draft 2 is what we would call it. The first draft, of course, was that piece of paper that certainly was tilted towards Russia, written by a Russian pretty much, and then passed off as a U.S. proposal. But I think right now, like you point out, this is a new draft. This is a second draft, and I think we'll just see what it does for the Russians.
Well, I'm beginning to get a sense that the Russians aren't going to like it, because the Russian deputy foreign minister, a man by the name of Sergei Ryabkov, told reporters in Moscow on Wednesday there can be no questions of any concessions or any surrender of our approaches to these key points. I mean, with that sort of an attitude, it doesn't sound like this deal's going to go very far, does it?
Well, it's negotiating tactics. You're right. It sounds like they're going to come in with a whole loaf, as we say, and they're going to ask for everything, a maximalist view, and then we're going to negotiate. And we'll see, number one, will they negotiate in good faith and in sincerity? And if they do negotiate, are they willing to make concessions? It looks like right now so many of the concessions are being made by the Ukrainians. So what are the Russians prepared to give on? And how important will these gives be? Are they minor things? Or are we going to see something major from them in terms of the land question, or maybe the security guarantee question? So we're going to just have to wait and see what the Russian tactics are going to be.
Right, and on the American side, in terms of the cast of characters, this week the Army Secretary Dan Driscoll is meeting Ukrainian officials. Steve Witkoff heading to Moscow to meet with President Putin in his inner circle. Marco Rubio sort of working between various different parties. Do you think these men can deliver?
Boy, again, it depends on the Russians. I think what we're seeing with this Trump team is really a different approach to what we're all used to in terms of the diplomatic community, the civil servant community, those of us who've done these kinds of things before. What we're looking at is the way businessmen do things, or the way maybe real estate moguls do things in Manhattan in terms of negotiating land. It's not following the protocols and the steps that we're used to seeing. So when we see them going off, these new characters, Jared Kushner is in there too. We sit there and we just we freak out a little bit because it's just something we don't recognize, and we don't think that they're going to be able to pull off something. But they just might. But it just depends on whether the Russians are in the mood to take yes for an answer. And even the best diplomats might not get something out of the Russians if the Russians don't want to give anything.
Right, and I expect Washington is still reeling from the report that was leaked by Bloomberg that Steve Witkoff had been advising one of President Putin's aides on how to go about pitching the deal back to President Trump. What was the reaction in your circle? What did people say about that? The White House said this is very standard negotiating tactic, but quite a lot of other people say they're not quite so sure about that.
Well, and also they're not sure about where do these transcripts come from? Who leaked them, and have they been doctored so that we're actually the victim of some type of intelligence service ploy? The last I heard was it was a European leak, so we don't know. But what Trump said on the plane to the journalists that you were just talking about, I think is actually descriptive. In Trump's world and in the world of Witkoff and Jared Kushner and people like that, what Witkoff did in terms of coaching the Russians on how do you approach his boss to get the boss on board something. To them, that's what you do in the real estate world, or at least in the business world. And so Trump didn't jump up and down and say, oh, my God, he's gone beyond his remit. If we had done that in a diplomatic setting, if I had gone off and done that, I would have been fired. It would have been terrible. So in Washington, yes, my community there is just still beside itself. Although, again, the parlor game is trying to figure out who did the leaking and what was behind it. But at the end of the day, it's two communities: the diplomatic community we're all used to, and then it's the real estate community, and we're just clashing into one another as we look at as we look at how this thing is implemented.
Yeah, and that probably explains a bit of the sort of backlash, and I should add, it's been bipartisan backlash. I mean, a quote from Representative Brian Fitzpatrick, a Republican. He's calling for a change in strategy. He called this Witkoff call a major problem, and he said these ridiculous sideshows and secret meetings need to stop. I mean, how representative is that sense of aggravation, shall we say, in the ranks of President Trump's own party?
Well, it's a really great question. I think his own party and the MAGA group of his party, as well as the White House insiders, there's some fighting going on. In fact, a lot of fighting going on, and so they're going to use any kind of thing that looks off or looks like it's a bad idea as a weapon against someone else within the MAGA community, and so we're going to see a lot of this kind of talk among Republicans as they draw lines and they take sides and they try to argue against the other. I mean, Dan Driscoll, the Secretary of the Army, who is now involved in these talks, is close to Vice President J.D. Vance. And we know that J.D. Vance and Marco Rubio could be butting heads in terms of the presidential sweepstakes coming up. So there's all kinds of side things going on that's political within that MAGA group. And just one last point, secret meetings, even the diplomatic community does that. Back channel discussions, sidebars, things that aren't necessarily made public. That's not unique to the Trump people. That's diplomacy too. So I have to give them a pass on that. But I think a lot of what the noise we're hearing out of Washington from Republicans is this infighting that's happening.
Right, and it sounds like there's a little bit of soul-searching in the ranks of the Republicans on foreign policy in quite a major way. I mean, when I read what Senator Mitch McConnell had been saying, another Republican, he said, Russia must not be rewarded. America is not a neutral arbiter, and we should not act like one. I mean, do you think there is this sense that perhaps President Trump is being unduly generous to the Russians and unfairly hard on the Ukrainians? After all, it was their country that was invaded, not the other way around.
Well, the idea that the U.S. Can even be a neutral party in this and the go-between is crazy, because, I mean, that was in the first draft. It had the U.S. Moderating discussions between NATO and Russia, and of course the United States is in NATO. So how can we be a neutral arbiter? And so I think there is a fantasy a bit in the White House, or at least they've convinced themselves that that's the role that they're going to play as a neutral arbiter between Ukraine and Russia. And at the end of the day, if it doesn't work out between the two parties, the U.S. can walk and say, well, we did our best. It's almost like marriage counseling, where the marriage counselor is going to do his best to make the couple come together. But if it doesn't work, they wash their hands of it and say, well, you all should just get a divorce. I think that's kind of how they're looking at themselves as in terms of a role to play. But so far, I have to say, in this marriage counseling, the U.S. certainly has been tilting towards one of the couples, and that's the Russian side. We'll see what this new draft looks like.
In terms of what you were saying earlier about how the Russians might or might not feel like playing ball, I mean, sanctions have been in place for more than 3 years now, and they've been tightened steadily over the course of the last three and a half years or so. And one quite prominent economist in Russia said this: if the Russian authorities want the economy to keep functioning normally, special military operations must be wound down. I mean, that seems to suggest that things are going to reach a sort of a tipping point in the Russian economy. I mean, a lot of pretty bleak indicators regarding the Russian economy. I mean, perhaps the screws could be tightened a little bit more, and perhaps it would be therefore worth waiting a little bit longer to try to strike a deal. What do you make of that argument?
Well, I think that's right. I think I guess, number one, in terms of the Russian economy, that's another parlor game in Washington, is everyone making judgments on the Russian economy and whether it's going to crumble, or that we are just making some predictions and underestimating the strength or the willingness of the Russian people to live under a poor economy. I think that I think we're betting too much that the economy is going to save the day, that the economy will get so bad that the Russians will have to pull back. And I think that is just a poor assumption that might work in a country like the United States or Belgium or someone in the West. But in Russia, I can't see that as causing the Russians to pull back. So I think there is this idea with Putin that we're going to probably see, which is he's going to play the long game. He thinks his economy is going to be fine. He thinks that given time, they'll make advances on the battlefield against Ukraine. He thinks that the clock is ticking louder for Ukraine than for him. So I think that we're going to probably see that. The sanctions that you mentioned, you're absolutely right. I mean, we've had sanctions, we're tightening them up, but there's some sanctions that we have not levied, and there's legislation on Capitol Hill that's going to have stiff penalties in them, and there's other things I think that we could be doing. I mean, the Tomahawk cruise missiles is, of course, something that Putin doesn't even want to think about. So there's some things that we can be doing to put the pressure on Russia, and until we do that, I don't think we're going to see him at the table.
And just lastly, I mean, do you envisage a scenario in which Russia says, yes, okay, we'll sign this deal, goes along with it for, let's say, 2 years, launches some sort of a false flag operation and says, look, Ukraine is in breach of the terms of the deal, and then reinvades Ukraine once it's regrouped and once its economy is on a slightly firmer footing? I mean, do you think that's a real danger of the plan as it is right now?
Well, absolutely. There's a real danger, whether it's that scenario or you could spin a lot of different scenarios about Russia coming back into the game, even with an agreement. And the Russian track record on agreements is not very good. We have the INF Treaty, the Budapest Memorandum, the Helsinki Accords, the Minsk Agreement. So that's why the security guarantee is so important, is that we have to hedge whatever is signed. We have to hedge that if it goes wrong after a couple of years, that the deterrence that we have set up keeps the Russians from doing something like that. The Ukrainian military is so strong, or the coalition of the willing is right in the vicinity and ready to move in, and that the United States has a sincere guarantee for Ukraine as well. The U.S. has got to play in this, and it's got to be something that we mean. It's got to be something that we stand behind. Article 5-like guarantees work only if the parties to that guarantee have shown a credible capability and willingness to back it up with force. We didn't have that with the Budapest Memorandum. We have to have that now.
Okay, well, we're going to leave it there. We're out of time, I'm told. Thank you very much indeed, though. Jim Townsend, former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for European and NATO policy at the Pentagon. Thank you for your time, sir.
You're very welcome.
Well, let's get more now. We can speak to General Dominique Trinquand, who's a former defense advisor to President Macron and former head of the French military mission to the UN and NATO. General Trinquand, always a pleasure talking to you. I'd like to start by asking you for your opinion on how the French leadership views the efforts being made by the Trump administration to end the war in Ukraine. What do they think?
In fact, the political and mainly Mr. Macron said that it was a good attempt. It's a good news that Mr. Trump is still working on a peace plan. Of course, the peace plan presented by the US was in fact a Russian one translated in American. So it was not very useful. So on last Sunday in Geneva, there was a meeting between the American, the Ukrainian and the European, and they presented another type of plan with certain points which were in the initial plan, and new ones. So a good attempt. This need more efforts, and we'll see in the future if finally the Russian will accept something, because currently they are not accepting anything.
Indeed, and that's something we've been discussing with our other guests today. But do you think that France feels, to some degree, slightly excluded from this whole process? And what's France doing to make sure that its voice and the voice of other European nations is being heard and that they've got a seat at the table?
No, you're right. I mean, the American President Trump and Mr. Putin don't want to speak to Europe. So concerning Mr. Trump, of course, France is pushing forward the possibility for Europeans to meet and to discuss and to exchange with Mr. Trump. That's why there was this meeting in Geneva. That's why in the next day there was a meeting in Angola, because the Europeans were in Angola at that time. And that's why also there was a meeting of the force of the willing, the coalition of the willing, to show that there were not only 3 countries, UK, France and Germany, but 30 countries working together on the same line. The problem will be, of course, discussion with the Russian, because the Russian will never accept to discuss with the European. But discussing with Mr. Trump is very useful to consolidate a plan between European, American and Ukrainian.
Yeah, so you're saying that, in fact, it suits probably Mr. Putin rather well to see Europe and the United States not always singing from the same song sheet. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, exactly. That's where Mr. Putin wants to go. But in fact, he's not successful until now. Each time there was a declaration or a plan by the US, the Europeans were going to the front, and finally there was a common position between the US and European.
We've heard President Macron saying this week the European continent is, quote, at great risk. Do you think there's a sense of fear in France as to the general direction things appear to be heading in?
Yes, I think for 2 reasons. The first reason is that the war, after nearly 4 years, is still ongoing in Ukraine. Ukraine is in difficulty, but also because we have different sorts of attacks in Europe and in France. We're talking about the drones, we're talking about cyber, about disinformation, and more the French people are looking at that as an aggression against Europe. And that's why there is this sense of tension in France currently.
Yeah, and in fact, just this week, one of the headline news stories in France is that a pro-Russian group has been arrested, well, certain members of that group, on suspicion of intelligence gathering for a foreign power. I mean, I'm assuming that is still top news in France. I mean, what sort of a mood is a story like that generating?
It shows that directly after what the chief of staff have said, is that Russia is targeting France and using different means, including people who are in France, because we had a very close link with Russian. We have people in France who are supporting Russia, and that's why we think that there is a temptation for them to attack the heart and mind of the French people. And that's why I think things are changing now, and you've got more and more people supporting the position, the supports of Ukraine, in fact.
Yeah, I was going to ask you how effective the disinformation campaigns have been. This particular group, by the way, had a slogan, Russia is not my enemy. And I'm wondering how much sympathy there is for that line of thinking, and how many people in France have been conditioned by disinformation campaigns to reconsider how they view Russia.
I think you've got probably, we don't know, but between 10 and 20% of French people who think like that for two reasons. The first one is Ukraine is far away, it's not our war, we don't want to be involved in that type of war. The second one is more on the really right side, far right side, where they say we have always been a friend with Russia, we don't want to change that. And that's probably the anti-Americanism feeling that has always existed in France, which is on the same line.
Okay, so we've got the situation where Russia, you're saying, is trying to destabilize France. These cyber attacks, the disinformation campaigns that we've already talked about. All of that being the case, are the security forces in France on very high alert, would you say?
Well, yes, certainly. I mean, we've got, but that was linked to the terrorist threat a few years ago, 10 years ago. We have a program called Sentinel, where we've got 3,000 troops in the street in France, patrolling, guarding, and yes, they are on alert. On the cyber, we have now a group which is called Viginium, which is working with the Prime Minister, which is trying to identify all the cyber and disinformation attacks and reacting very quickly. The aim is to react the same day as the attacks happen. And apparently it's working well.
Okay, and President Macron has made another announcement this week. And just to be clear for our viewers, he hasn't announced the return of conscription, but he has announced that thousands of young volunteers are going to start serving in the military as of next year. And I'm wondering, I mean, what's your interpretation of this? It doesn't seem like a coincidence, does it, given the context that we've just been talking about there in France?
Yes, of course, it's just the change of the context. 10 years ago, President Macron introduced what was called le Service National Universel, Universal National Service. The aim was not to train soldiers. The aim was to have young people, 700,000 young people each year, which will be educated for 2 weeks in citizenship in different way and mix all the people come from everywhere in France. That was a failure because, in fact, this was run by the Ministry of Defense and Ministry of Education, and like that. So now this national service, explained by President Macron a few hours ago, is in the end of the Ministry of Defense. And the aim is to prepare soldiers, but in very few figures. 3,000 next year, 2026, up to 50,000 in 2035. The aim is to reinforce the capacity to join the army and to have a reserve which is trained during 10 months and then join the reserve or join the army.
Do you think other European countries ought to follow suit, those that don't already have initiatives like this?
You've got a European country in the north, for example, who have already reintroduced the national service. You have Germany, for example, who tried to do it, but Parliament doesn't agree. Anyway, all European countries have a problem of manpower. Demography in Europe is a catastrophe. In 2035, in France, we'll not be able to enlist as many people as we want. So we have to do something. And I think all European countries must look at this sort of experience.
In this context, there's been another sort of headline in France this week because the head of the French armed forces, General Fabien Mondon, said that France needs the strength of character to accept losing some of its children. That's the translation, the rough translation into English, so do correct me if that's not accurate. How much debate has this generated, and why has it generated so much debate? I mean, isn't this a reality?
I think it's a generated debate between politicians. Of course, General Mondon was saying that, talking about the soldier. And each time I was on the program, I say, but, well, the soldiers are not children of France? I don't understand why you are focusing on that. It doesn't say, perhaps the word sacrifice was not good. The word we need commitment of the young people, commitment of the French people would have been better. But anyway, I think the problem was more a political one. When you see that after introducing this new national volunteer service, 85% of the French people are for this national service. So it changed completely the perspective from the politicians.
General Trinquand, just to wrap up this conversation, overall, when you look at the situation in Moscow and in Kyiv and the efforts being made by Washington to mediate, how optimistic are you that we might finally be close to a deal being struck?
I don't think we are very close. Mr. Putin wants to continue the war. He just have made a declaration this afternoon saying either Ukraine withdraw from the occupied part of Ukraine, when he's saying that is the 4 oblasts in the east, or will fight. Of course, Ukraine will not withdraw. He wants to conquer this part of Ukraine. Ukraine is fighting very hardly to maintain its position. For Pokros, for example, they've been fighting for 80 months, and the Russian advance is only 10 kilometers. So I think it will last long until Mr. Putin understands that he's not only killing Ukrainian, but probably killing more Russian, and this will be a very big problem in the future for Russia.
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed for your time. General Dominique Trinquand, thank you very much indeed, sir.
Thank you, bye.
Well, let's get more on this papal visit, and we can speak now to Dr. Gavin Ashenden, who's a former chaplain to Queen Elizabeth II, who converted to Catholicism. He's also an author, a columnist, and a presenter on television. Thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us, Dr. Ashenden. Pope Leo's first trip outside of Italy as pontiff is going to be to Turkey and then to Lebanon. I mean, Turkey is the first stop. What's the rationale, do you think, behind visiting a Muslim-majority country first?
Well, things are always multi-layered, so we can look at one of the 6 different layers, I think. But the reason is actually not strategic, it's just accidental, an accident of history. The Council of Nicaea, which sets the blood running for all theological students, took place 1700 years ago. It was enormously important as a moment when Christianity gathered itself and made declarations about self-understanding that remained the platform of the faith today. So, of course, everyone now knows that Nicaea was in Turkey, and far from being the Christian center that one would imagine would have lasted forever, was taken over by the Ottoman Empire, and it now represents a tiny, tiny enclave of Christianity in Turkey. So he's going because that's where the history dates take him. But as it happens, not surprisingly, there are a great many other elements in play as well, because for the head of Christianity to visit such a significant Islamic republic carries all kinds of geopolitical resonances with it.
Okay, well, let's turn our attention back to the present day and talk about Pope Leo and what he is aiming to achieve. What do you think the message is he brings with him to Turkey?
I think it's probably a visual message. I can't imagine that there are many things that can be said or negotiated. After all, was it Napoleon who said, how many brigades does the Pope have? He's not a political or a military leader in that sense, but he is symbolically, wearing white so strikingly, the leader of Western Christendom. So I think the fact that he goes to speak to President Erdogan and that President Erdogan will give him a handshake and accord him respect, that will, to some extent, I think, surprise the people of Turkey. And they will say, this is, well, perhaps we should look at Christians in a slightly less prejudiced way than we have done. So I'm hoping the visual optics will offer some greater improvement to Christian-Muslim relations in Turkey, which are not very good.
Now, Pope Leo assumed the papacy about 6 months ago, and he's tended, I think it's fair to say, to keep his geopolitical views to himself. Do you think we're going to find out more about those views during the course of this trip?
Yes, we are. I think it's going to be very exciting too. The Christendom is waiting to discover whether he's more like Pope Francis or Pope Benedict. And a lot hangs on this. So first of all, this visit was prepared when Pope Francis was alive. It should be Pope Francis doing it if the planners had anything to do with it, but death intervenes for many of us unexpectedly. So yes, he's taken up Pope Francis's diary, and it's going to be very interesting to see the extent to which he brings his own individual judgment to bear on the tasks ahead of him. I think you could probably say that the relationship between Christians and Muslims at this present geopolitical moment is probably about the most important dynamic in human world affairs.
Okay, and his next stop after Turkey, he's going to spend 3 days in Turkey, then he's going to go to Lebanon, which has the largest percentage of Christians in the Middle East. And when he's there, he's going to be talking to some of the 12 different Christian community leaders. There's 12 different sects of Christian alone in Lebanon. He's also going to hold private meetings with Muslim and Druze religious leaders. How helpful do you think this kind of interfaith dialogue actually is?
Gosh, that's really such a good question and absolutely impossible to answer. One can answer from so many different angles. At one level, the interfaith dialogue has produced almost no fruit at all in terms of changing the way in which religions officially deal with each other. But as always in human affairs, and this is partly why Christians are so excited incarnation. So much depends upon human relations, what happens when human beings get together, meet one another, recognize in each other a degree of authenticity and of value that, if you like, the stereotyping images we hold of one another never convey. So this principle of the incarnation, finding God in others, a deeper respect and an affection in others, the possibilities are without limit. So depending upon how Pope Leo is perceived by them, whether they trust him, admire him, like him, respect him, and how much that's reciprocated, lays the possibility of ameliorated relationships, which will have knock-on effects, because all these people belong to wider communities. And as you know, in the Middle East, the fabric of community is deeply interwoven, and the way this can resonate would be endless.
Would you expect the Pope to address the situation in Gaza, which is, after all, not so very far away from Lebanon?
Well, if I was advising him, I would suggest that he say nothing at all about it, because essentially this is not a conflict in which the Catholic Church plays any obvious role. Historically, you can't get away from Catholic influence anywhere, because the Catholic Church is the West embryonically. But I would imagine, so for a start, one of his representatives there, the Bishop of Jerusalem, has already offered himself as a hostage earlier on. So the Catholic Church has been busy in a humanitarian way, symbolically and practically. I think the people on the ground will do all the work, and it may be that one of the things he's there to do is to strengthen the people on the ground and to explain how grateful he is for everything they're doing to cross the boundaries of interreligious and international hatred.
And just lastly, Dr. Ashenden, a practical question. This is the first ever American Pope, and popes usually speak Italian, don't they, when they're on, or Latin when they're officiating at Mass. What language do you think he's going to speak on this trip?
That's a very interesting observation. It didn't do Pope John Paul II any harm to speak Polish, but his English was not bad. I think there's a great deal to be said for the Pope speaking English. Some of the difficulty that Pope Francis left behind him was because things got lost in translation, or insofar as popes, I think, rather irresponsibly talk to the press off the cuff. The danger of using a word with a nuance you didn't intend it to have is always significant. I think it's very helpful that the Pope speaks Esperanto, which is English, or American English, and it will make him seem more familiar, more accessible, more comprehensible, more lucid to a lot of people. So it's a small thing, but I think it's an advantage we can be grateful for.
OK, well, we're going to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. Dr. Gavin Ashenden, former chaplain to Queen Elizabeth II. Thank you very much indeed for joining us on Arabiya English. Well, that is all we have time for on Global News today. Thank you very much indeed for watching. Be sure to join us again tomorrow for a look back at some of the best interviews of the week. Until then, goodbye.